Welcome everyone to today's Explainer. We are taking a really fascinating deep dive into the hidden architectural plans of modern fantasy. We're going to look at some of our most beloved fictional worlds, but we're going to do it through the academic lens of intertextuality. Essentially, we'll see how authors don't just, invent stories out of thin air. They actually act a lot more like master architects, using incredibly old blueprints to build entirely new, towering structures of imagination. Okay, let's dive right into this. Have you ever wondered if The Boy Who Lived is actually built upon the ancient foundation of Camelot? I know, it sounds a little wild at first, but when you really look closely at the framework, you start to see that Harry Potter shares an immense amount of literary DNA with the story of a young King Arthur, specifically from T.H. White's absolute classic, The Sword and the Stone. And these aren't just fun little coincidences either. This is a deliberate, endlessly fascinating method of storytelling. So here is the blueprint for our literary cathedral today. First, authors as cathedral builders. Second, the portal to magic. Third, the problematic foster fathers, followed by the bullying foster brothers. Then we'll map out the savior's journey, and finally, trace the fantasy lineage. Let's get to work. Section 1. Authors as cathedral builders. And this brilliantly illustrates a concept from C.S. Lewis. In his essay, The Genesis of a Medieval Book, Lewis actually compared authors to medieval cathedral builders. Just think about an ancient cathedral for a second. It is rarely the work of just one person, or even one single era, right? An architect uses an old foundation. Maybe they incorporate a beautiful stained glass window from an older or ruined church, and then they build a brand new Gothic spire right on top of it. Well, authors do the exact same thing. They combine old classical structures with their own modern innovations. Now, in academic terms, this whole cathedral building process, it's called intertextuality, and a very specific subset of this is called bricolage. Bricolage is basically the act of making a new text from the oddments left over by previous authors to create a highly original work of art. It is absolutely not plagiarism, it's an evolution. It's like you're taking the leftover stones of a previous castle to build your own fortress. And when we apply this specific lens to fantasy literature, the connections become incredibly clear. Let's move to a timeline and see how this actually builds across history. Back in the 15th century, Sir Thomas Malory wrote the definitive medieval Arthurian epic, Morte d'Arthur. Centuries later, T.H. White took Malory's medieval oddments and built the once and future king, but he injected his own 20th century pacifist ideals right into the stone. Then, stepping fully into the 21st century, J.K. Rowling takes White's blueprints and constructs the entire world of Harry Potter. It is a direct, linear evolution of narrative architecture. Moving on to Section 2, the portal to magic. So both White and Rowling employ three very distinct types of fantasy to kind of push their heroes out of the nest. First up is intrusion fantasy, which is where magic aggressively breaks into the mundane world. Think of that iconic flurry of Hogwarts letters flooding the Dursley house, or the wizard Merlin just suddenly arriving at Sir Ector's perfectly normal medieval castle. Then we have portal fantasy, where the hero actually crosses a threshold into the magic realm, so Harry going to Hogwarts, or the wart entering the magical forest Savage. And finally, there's wainscot fantasy, which is this super cool idea of a magical society hiding in plain sight just behind the walls of the mundane world. By combining all three of these, both authors force their heroes into a highly stressful, constant commute between a magic world that empowers them and a mundane world that totally rejects them. And honestly, it's exhausting enough just being an 11-year-old without having to constantly commute between alternate dimensions. Section 3. The problematic foster fathers. You'll notice both stories actually start not with the hero, but with the foster father. In White's story, we have Sir Ector. Ector is this blustering authoritarian whose power comes from his wealth rather than his wisdom. He is a lovable but definitely hypocritical fool who represents all the flaws of medieval feudalism. But over in Rowling's world, we get Vernon Dursley. Rowling takes Ector's blueprint, sure, but she builds something far more grotesque. Vernon is abusive and violently anti-magic. While Ector represents medieval flaws, Vernon, a man whose company literally makes drills, represents the cold, dispassionate flaws of modern technology and secular industrialism. Rowling took White's foundation, but she added this dark, grotesque gargoyle to her cathedral, inspired pretty heavily by the author Roald Dahl. Section 4. The bullying foster brothers. Now, what's really interesting here is how the foster brother dynamic evolves. In White's tale, Arthur's foster brother is Sir Kay. And Kay is spoiled, he's a bully, but his bad behavior actually stems from deep, deep insecurity. He is secretly jealous that the wart gets to experience Merlin's incredible magic while he's left out. He's flawed, but he's highly human. Dudley Dursley, on the other hand, Dudley is basically Kay stripped entirely of that humanizing jealousy. Dudley is violent, he is fully aligned with his father Vernon's bigotry, and he is completely devoid of any magical curiosity. By darkening that foster brother figure, Rowling massively increases her hero's suffering and isolation in the mundane world.
Section 5. The Savior's Journey.
We really have to ask ourselves, why does a hero need to suffer? Like, why make them orphans living with these terrible foster families in the first place? Well, because it forms the exact blueprint of the suffering servant savior. Here is that three-step architecture. Step 1. The hero suffers profound isolation and abuse in the mundane world, which teaches them intimately about its flaws. Step 2. They discover empowerment, mentorship, and a totally new worldview over in the magic world. And finally, Step 3. They must return to reform and save the very mundane world that rejected them. Arthur has to reform Ector and Kay's warmongering medieval society, and Harry has to defeat Voldemort, whose pure-blood supremacy perfectly and tragically mirrors the bigotry Harry already experienced under the Dursleys.
So, the crucial point here is how their differing childhoods actually affect their heroic motivations. The Wart is written as a naturally trusting hero. He acts out of pure altruism. He loves Ector and Kay despite their many flaws. But because Rowling made Vernon and Dudley so much more grotesque and abusive, Harry's journey realistically cannot start with pure nobility. Instead, Harry is initially driven by sheer survival. He just wants to not be killed by Voldemort. It is only over time, as he matures and realizes the broader ideological threat to both magical and mundane people, that his motivation evolves into the same sweeping altruism that Arthur has.
And finally, Section 6, the fantasy lineage. So as we've seen, intertextuality absolutely does not mean just copying a past work. No way. It means taking the blueprints of the past and building an entirely new wing onto the literary cathedral. Rowling took White's commuting orphan, his problematic foster father, and his bullying foster brother, but she innovated. She added deeply complex female guardians like Aunt Petunia, who harbored a secret, painful childhood jealousy of magic. She incorporated Roald Dahl's darker, much more grotesque elements into the Dursleys, and by doing all of that, she deepened the hero's melancholy and isolation, giving us a modern, slightly gothic addition to the fantasy landscape.
And we know this connection is 100% real. J.K. Rowling herself explicitly stated, the Wart is Harry's spiritual ancestor. That explicit acknowledgement is just a beautiful proof of the magic of literary lineage. It shows us that storytelling is this ongoing, massive collaborative project across centuries. We are all sharing DNA, building upon the foundations laid by those who came before us to tell stories that resonate today.
Which leaves us with a really provocative thought to end our explainer today. What oddments of modern stories will you use to build your own cathedral? Whether you are a writer, a creator, or honestly just a passionate reader, I invite you to start looking for the hidden blueprints in literally everything you consume. Thank you so much for joining me today, Focus Learners. Keep exploring, keep reading, and I will see you in the next explainer.